So in this video, I'm going to show you what if you want to place an object, have it interact with the ground, and have a shadow on the ground, and even possibly a reflection and refraction. And this is still a work in progress. I'm still figuring out the best ways to do this. So I'll give you what I know, and then maybe if you figure out some better ways, you can comment or something. So I'm going to quickly run through the basic tripod track, so just sit back and relax. I'm going to try to do this as quick as possible. So I'm in the movie clip editor. I'm going to open a totally different image sequence, but one that has a clear ground in it. It's from the Children's Museum. I'm going to set my scene frames. I think it's already set to 250. I'm going to prefetch. And then since this is a simple tripod track, I'm just going to track a few points that are, across the whole frame, from one side to the other. So there's some good separation between them, and maybe this one. So let's just see how we do with 3 tracks. I'm going to go to Solve. I'm going to hit Tripod and track camera. So it's 1.17. And now I think, so that's fine because the camera movement isn't that dramatic. There's a little tilt up, and then it just kind of, you can tell it's handheld. But the camera I was using did not have a 35mm sensor. It was a Canon Rebel. And I know that I looked it up. I think it has an APS-C sensor, which is, I know it's 22 about. And I was zoomed out all the way, and that lens only zooms out to about 18mm. So I'm going to solve it. And now right there, we've already improved it. We're below 1. Let's see if I refine focal length. We're at 0.6, and it's saying, oh, it was a 23. I'm going to set that back to 18, and let's just jump up to the refine focal length and K1 and K2. So now it's saying it's a 19mm lens, which is much closer to being accurate, and the K1 and K2 have some values, and I have a pretty low solve error. So I'm going to go to the 3D viewport. I deleted my cube. I'm going to jump into the camera view, click my camera, add background images, add movie clip. There's my camera clip. I'm going to do the constraints now and add a camera solver. So now the camera should move. Okay, so now I'm going to reset my camera. So I'm going to clear the location, so Alt-G, and clear the rotation. So in my mind, I know the camera's looking straight down, but I want to see that grid again. So I'm going to move it up on the Z-axis, GZ5. And now I want this center point to be my pivot point. So I'm going to hit period and go to 3D cursor. The 3D cursor is already centered. If it's not, do Shift-S, cursor to world origin. So now I'm looking for, you can see this line of the wall is going up to the horizon that way, and this line is going that way. So it has to meet somewhere there. But I think I'm going to turn down the alpha of my background image just so I can help myself see a little better. So I'm just eyeballing it, maybe about there. I'm going to move my camera up above the ground. So maybe there. And then I'm going to move it back. So what I'm going to do is line up that origin on that wall and rotate it on the Z now and see, how well does that, I'm going to move it on the X. I'm going to just try to get that green line to follow that line of the wall and see, just how well does that line follow. And that's pretty good. There is a little slipping because there's kind of a fast movement right here. It's not perfect. It feels like the floor drops slightly more than it should, but for the rest of the clip, it looks pretty good. And actually, further into the clip, it looks like that line doesn't look so great, that green line along the wall. So I'm going to hit R, and I want to bring up the horizon, so I'm going to hit X and X again. I'm going to hold Shift to kind of fine-tune my, so that's better. I'm going to bring the origin back out by moving the camera just on the X-axis. So there's going to be my origin. Okay, so the first thing, let's add a plane, and let's scale it up. And then I'm going to add a sphere and move that up. I'm going to right-click on it to do shade smooth, because that's how you do that now. And let's just make this ball drop. So I'm going to really quickly add some rigid body dynamics. I added a passive to the ground, rigid body, and I'm going to add, rigid body, and it's active to the ball. So this ball drops like pretty slow. If I bring up the properties, and if I click this ball, I see it has a dimension of 2 meters, which is practically 6 feet. So if you have your scene set up and you have these simulations going, and if you want like kind of real world scale and speed, if I select everything and if I hit scale, let's double check that, scale. Okay, so make sure everything is selected, and then make sure you're scaling based on the 3D cursor. So now what's actually happening is now when I scale, it's scaling, everything is scaling to this point. So it's really like shrinking your world. Oops. I'm going to back up to frame 1 because that's where the ball wants to start. So I'm going to, the ball is the active object. It's 2 meters. I'm going to scale it till it's about 0.5 meters, which is, you know, more reasonable size ball. Okay, I'm going to click that ball. I don't think you have to do this, but Control A to apply the scale. Just, it's good practice when you're simulating objects. And now this ball, I'm going to hit period, scale it. So now the ball is, and let me quick give it some bounce. It's in the surface response. I'll set the ball bounciness up to 0.5, or that's the ground, and the ball to 0.5. Okay, so if we go into rendered mode right now, this is Eevee render, and for visual effects where you're combining, you want to use cycles in my opinion. So go to your camera option, click cycles, and we're getting some more realistic shading. We can't see the world anymore, so scroll down to film, open that, and hit transparency. So now we can kind of see the world behind us, and if we render it, we'll get something. But okay, here's where the magic happens. It's really easy to add a shadow. So we want the ball to render and just the shadow. So click the plane on that ground plane. Let's even call it shadow, because all we're going to see is the shadow. If we click this little square, the object data tab, scroll to the bottom to cycle settings, and click this shadow catcher option. So now if we were to render it, it's going to look a lot better. A couple things you got to do first though, or you might as well do, is make the lighting in your scene kind of match the lighting of your video clip. So I'm going to just move this light over on the X. I'm going to change the type of light to be an area because I can see these like little overhead fluorescent lights. I'm going to clear the rotation with Alt-R. I'm going to increase the size to make it more like a fluorescent light, move it up, and then duplicate it and move it on the Y. So now we have some, I'm going to duplicate those and move them on the X. So now we have some relatively similar lighting. Just for the heck of it, let's make this ball red. Or a nice weird bronze. Okay. So we have our ball and it's bouncing. I will go to render, but the first thing I like to do, we're going to be doing a lot of tweaking. So go to your little print options, set the resolution to 50%, go to your camera options and scroll up to sampling or scroll down to it. Set that to maybe 64 samples and set your device if you have it to GPU compute. And that should use both your CPU and your GPU now, so you don't have to change the tile size. So let me pause it and save my project. Okay, so it's paused, and let me hit, it's saved. Let me hit render. I don't really like it when this screen pops up. So if you go to the render tab or the render menu up top, say lock interface and say display mode image editor. So now when I hit F12 to render, you could also have hit it up here. There's a little render image. Okay, we get this. So I'm going to go to the compositor now, and let's use nodes and use a backdrop. So here's our render layer. We need to bring in our video clip, input, movie clip, and it should be the only one there, so it knows. And now I need to like combine these together, right? So I got to add a color alpha over, and basically you're going to drag the background into the first socket, the new image into the top socket, and then if I drag this in here, we won't see it, but if I use that viewer node, that backdrop, Control Shift click, and we have something. So to zoom out, you can use in the properties this zoom. I think N also does it, and hold Alt and middle mouse click to drag it around. So something's wrong, right? This is a full HD image and this is only half resolution. So the way around it is I always add a distort scale node in between this movie clip and the alpha over, and I set this to render size. So no matter what size I render at, the clip will match. The placement looks a little weird, probably just where I placed the ball, so that's my bad. But as you can see, we have a shadow, we have the ball. Another thing I like to do is usually the render is much more crisp than our cameras shoot, so I also add a filter, and then I set it to like 0.5, and that helps kind of, Alt V zooms in and V zooms out. You know, it helps kind of smooth out those edges. So let's start tweaking it to get this a little better. But that's the basic right there. This is like, you know, we added that plane and just chose it to be a shadow catcher, and that's it. But let's say, what if you wanted a glass object and you wanted the background to refract in it, or if you wanted a reflection. And this is where the results get a lot less perfect. First off, let me turn up the alpha of this image so we can kind of replace the ball, because I wasn't too happy with the placement. It looks too close to the wall. So I'm going to go back to frame 1 and let me just move it out on the X a little bit. Yeah, and it's probably actually a little too big of a ball, but oh well. Okay, well, we'll start with the easy stuff. So let's say, what if your ball is really smooth, right? We don't see this shadow catcher, but we can see a white plane being reflected. So a lot of times what I'll do is click this plane, and I want it to at least match the color of the ground. You could project the image onto it, but it usually isn't necessary. So what I'm going to do is, let me turn up the alpha of our image clip, our background image, all the way so I can see the full color. Click this ground plane, choose base color, choose the eyedropper, and I'm just going to grab that clip. And now we can see, if I go to look dev, at least it's kind of gray. And if I go to rendered, at least I'm getting kind of a gray ground. The next thing, our lights are reflecting, but there's nothing in the scene. It's just this gray image, and that's actually too dark. So the quickest way is grab the eyedropper and click someplace in the scene to brighten it up. So that alone is going to help give you a better render. So let's see. Yeah, it's already starting to look, but you know, we're getting crazy since it's kind of a white background. It's starting to reflect white when really, you know, it's not quite white. But I would say this is pretty solid. If that reflection wasn't so pristine, you wouldn't even notice. But let's say it is pristine. So another trick is, in your world setting, instead of using just a flat color, use an HDRI or environment texture. So I clicked this little socket. I'm going to choose an environment texture. Now, you can download a lot of these online. I've already been amassing a collection of homemade ones, and I make these using the app Google Street View, which allows you to jump into your camera and take pictures all the way around yourself, up in the air and below you, and it creates this 360. So, you know, you might, if you don't have one of that exact location, you could say, oh, this one of the library looks decent, but I actually did get one of the children's museum, so I'm going to choose that one. And if we want to see it, just so you can kind of preview it, I'm going to turn off the transparency, and you know, it's the children's museum. So yeah, that's a little trick. And now the reflections in it, are more interesting and probably more accurate. So let's render that out. It still has that white harsh edge, but this is like, I would say this is where I would stop if I was doing the project. But I'm tempted often to see if I can bring the reflection into the ground, because you see the door is reflecting. And so you could stop here, but the last few parts are really just like, let's see if we can push the realism to at least my max. And actually the easiest thing is, well, let's just start with a simple, a glass shader. Let's say we want to at least see, using that HDRI might have been good enough, but a trained eye might realize like, oh, this wall should be refracting in it. So the easiest way to do that is let's add a new plane and call this plane wall, and let's rotate it on the Y, and I'm going to go into solid shading mode. I'm just hitting Z to bring that up to have all these options. Let's move it down on the X to the wall, and move it up on the Z, and maybe go into edit mode. I'm going to pull these points up, go into wireframe, push these points back on the Y. And really you want to cover any of these gaps. So actually, even though the wall is pretty much lined up, I'm just going to pull it all the way down and pull it really far up. Oop. Sure. Because there's no real depth to this, since it's just a tripod track, oops. And I'm going to extrude some there. So now we have this kind of false wall, and I want this to have relatively square shapes because we're gonna unwrap this. So these two look square, and those two are square enough. So I'm going to select everything, right click and hit subdivide to bring that menu up, and I'll just subdivide this quite a few times because it'll limit distortion on when you actually unwrap it. So from your camera view now, hit U to unwrap and say project from view, and let's give it a new material, and I'm going to split the view here, go into the shader editor, and if I have my principled selected, hit Control T, and really this could be a diffuse, so I'm going to hit Shift S to change the shader to just diffuse, or really it could be an emission shader as well. That might be the best one, because really it's going to be emitting our video clip. So emission, the strength is at 1, and let's open up. So I had that image sequence, right, of the video. I'm just going to grab the first image, say open image, and now if we go to look dev, we can see some kind of distortion. So I'm going to right click and hit subdivide again, and maybe that should be enough. Maybe one more. Yeah. It also might help once you subdivide it to U, project from view again. So now we have like a really clean image, and we have the doors now refracting, and we have the those little circles right there refracting, but we don't want to see this wall, right? So I'm going to go to the cycle settings. So instead of turning on a shadow catcher, I'm going to leave all these. I'm going to turn off the camera visibility, and now hit render. Also, I think that wall is casting a little bit of a shadow right there. We don't quite see the line. I think that's the line right there. So also turn off it's not going to cast a shadow. It's just going to influence the glossy and transmission. Transmission means when light passes through, so like in glass. So here is our shadow catcher, and yeah, so that is pretty awesome. Okay, so now here's a slightly more advanced technique. So notice we have the reflection of the ball on the ground, and there are some problems with this. I rendered it at low samples. You can see the reflection gets cut off right there, but it does give it its own, I think it gives it a more realistic feel, and it also would solve situations of if you have, like I had an X-wing flying over like a wet beach, and it would have been a good time to have some reflective surface. So how do we go about doing that? So so this is about where we left off, except I changed the ball to be a red ball. And if we go into our solid, we still have our shadow catcher and our background. Also with Blender 2.8, when you have an animation, like especially rigid body, I baked the animation. So go to this scene tab, and it was within this rigid body world. You can dig down into cache, and I had my current, I baked the simulation. So the first thing, yeah, let's just leave it solid. So this is our shadow catcher, right? If I hit period, I can see it. There it is selected. So I'm going to make a new plane, and I'm going to call this, let's see. Oh, here it is. It's not even in the same collection anymore. Yours might be, depending on what was selected when you added it. I'm going to call this reflection. If I can just, yeah. I find grabbing between windows is a little harder with the new Blender, at least on my computer. So we have this reflection. As you can see, there's like some artifacts being created because it's in the exact same space as the other one. So the reflection plane, you're going to move up on the Z-axis and hold Shift and just move it up like 1 or 2 pixels. And this is going to be okay because we're going to render this out on a different layer, and on this current layer it's going to totally ignore this plane, so we don't have to worry about it casting a shadow or anything. But let's get the material set up. I'm going to go to wireframe and just eyedrop this ground so it's kind of a gray, or what color would that be, like brown, and I'm going to turn down the roughness quite a bit. So we're starting to see some of those reflections again. Now, when I play it, I'm going to shrink this plane because we only care about that piece of the ball that's reflecting, right? So I'm just going to shrink this plane, rotate it, move it on the X, and just kind of make sure that the reflection stays. So like right there, I need to increase it. I'm going to hit YY to increase it along its normal. So now the reflection will stay in view the whole time. Now to get that reflection isolated, because we don't want the background reflected, we just want that ball, and we don't want to see anything else but that reflection. You're going to click the third tab down. It looks like stacked photos, and there's something called, if you click into it, there's something called passes. And so I think I'm getting a little ahead of myself. So we will use that passes, but right now, if we render, it's going to render everything as one layer, and we need to put this on its own layer. Let me quick render it out. So as you can see, there is a shadow catcher, but then this reflection layer is on top. Also, I turned on motion blur. I think that should be on by default, but I had to turn it on, which gives it that nice motion blur. So we need to get rid of this reflection and bring it back in the compositor later. So I'm going to create a new view. I'm going to first move this to its own collection. We have this primary collection, which has our shadow catcher and ball, and I'm going to make a new collection for this. So I'm going to hit M, new collection. It's going into its new collection called reflection, and I'm going to hit OK. So now we have 2 collections. And this reflection collection, we're in this current view layer. I'm just going to right click on it, click view layer, and say set to exclude. So now it's totally being ignored. So now I can, render it out. It just renders out ball and our shadow catcher quite nicely. But let's create a new view layer by going up to the top right, clicking that little paper tab, and it can be called view layer 01 or whatever you want. So we're looking at a totally new view layer now, and what I'm going to do is, let's just so you can see what's going on. That top collection, I'm going to right click and say view layer set holdout. So what it's going to do is anything that was in that collection, it's going to become basically invisible or a mask. Okay. The last thing, we're still in this view layer 001. I'm going to go to passes, and I want to bring out, instead of just having like a render, I want to isolate the glossiness. I'm going to isolate direct and indirect glossiness. So now when I render, it should render out two layers. It's going to render out view layer, the first one, and then view layer 001. Okay, so if we go into the compositor, we need to create a new render, or we need to bring in a new render layer. There's our first one called view layer, so let's duplicate it. And let's switch it to view layer 001, and there is, you can kind of see the render. So now if I control and shift click on image, that's what it looks like. There's the alpha, there's depth, glossy direct. I think it's just saying the glossiness of this material, and glossy indirect are like objects that bounced, and I don't understand it quite well, but glossy indirect is what you want. So we need to put this, we need to get that glossiness behind the ball, right? So really what I'm going to do is I'm going to put that glossiness on top of, it's going to be the movie clip, it's going to get distorted, and I'm going to add that with a color mix. So this is what I normally do, mix. This is what I used to do. Just drag that in, or no, drag the glossy indirect in, and I would set it to maybe like add. And then as you can see, the before and after is not that dramatic. Here's the before, and then here's the after. You see a little red, and I might have tried to boost it up. But the real issue is, and we still see the door reflection. The real issue is there's no alpha to this channel. It's just showing straight color. So there's the ball and everything else is black. So what I found is that kind of works if you go Shift A, add a matte and a luminance key. So I'm going to right click on this luminance key, Shift Control click on the luminance key. If I start dragging down that value of the high, basically it's bringing, so if you have it set to 0, it has everything. And if we start clipping out, if we start dragging it up, holding shift, it's going to start fading everything out that's the darkest. And that's what our matte looks like. So now what I'm going to do is drag this image, and instead of adding it, I'm just going to say mix. And at first it doesn't look right, but you have to click this little alpha, include alpha button. Yeah, and that still looks quite odd, so I'm going to just increase the alpha a bit. Also, it's not really blurred very well, so I'm going to Shift D to add that soften filter, and maybe I'll soften this quite a bit. Also, one of the reasons why it was looking quite strange is I had this set to 2, so when you're mixing you should only have it set to like 1, and I think I can drag that value back down now. That's why I was getting some weird. So that doesn't look, that great, but part of it is we're rendering on really low samples on a frame that's 50% size. But I'm going to just see if I can bump up the brightness using color RGB curves of this reflection. So let me move that up. I'm holding Alt and middle mouse clicking. I think you can also use these options. I'm just going to bump up the brightness a bit before the Luma key, and increase the Luma a bit. And then with this mix node, I'm just going to drop it because, yeah, it doesn't look that great, especially in a freeze frame. It might look better with motion, but I think this is probably the best solution that I've found. And maybe I'll increase that to kind of carve out the edges. I think that looks pretty great. Another thing, when you're rendering, especially with these, within your sampling, remember to turn on this stopwatch. It's, you know, it's in sampling, set your samples, turn on this stopwatch so the grain will animate as if it's video noise.